I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. Welcome to Politely Pushy. I'm your host, Eric Chemi. Today I've got Professor Mark Congdon. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. Professor Mark, Dr. Mark, or do I just call you Mark? Thanks for coming on the show with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And yes, you can just call me Mark. That's what my students call me.
You let your students call you by your first name. See, I'm getting too old. It's this whole new generation, right?
It's more informal and it's just easier.
So tell me, what is current, like 2022, modern communication studies? Like, what's on the syllabus? What are the students studying? Because it's been 2 decades since I was in college. How has the world changed in terms of what students coming out of school, going into the workforce, what they have learned?
Yeah, though I'm in communication studies, I specifically focus on PR and advertising. And so communication studies is a very broad field, but specifically within PR, the field has evolved and changed drastically, especially with the pandemic. And so specifically with a lot of things now are virtual and digital. And so understanding how digital advertising is working, understanding how you need to use digital analytics to understand whether or not what you're doing is effective and reaching your target audience. And that also then connects to really tailoring all your messaging and things that you're doing to a segmented audience. And so I would say with the pandemic, it just exacerbated the transformation to everything digital. And so now digital, I would say, is more standard and mainstream than previously.
Do you think all of the pandemic work, right? COVID, obviously it was remote learning, distance learning, Zoom learning, right? This podcast is being done digitally and remotely across multiple state borders. Did that help with the digital transformation of that young demographic as they go into the workforce? Did it hurt them because learning is still better in person, even if you're learning about things that are digital and you're going to work from home in your job? What was your experience, and how did you see your students either adapt or struggle to adapt?
Yeah, so I think at least with my classes, so I tend to even when I'm teaching in person, I tend to design my courses through what is known as the hybrid or blended model, where things are done online and can be done remotely. And so it was a really easy transition, at least for me, in terms of adapting my classes in that manner. In terms of students, I would say overall, students tended to struggle in terms of switching everything to virtual. But I found that in terms of students being exposed to certain digital tools and technologies, that exposure, I think, happened a lot sooner than if they didn't have that experience because of the pandemic, then they would have went right into the workforce. But I also think too that it just elevated and exacerbated I made it much quicker. So in terms of businesses and even higher ed, adapting certain technologies and digital tools, it just happened a lot quicker because you were forced to. And now I think what's going on is figuring out what's that balance, but then also how do you utilize these tools in a more strategic manner and not in a way that's just rushed together and thrown together because you needed to just teach online, or you needed to adapt your PR, advertising, and marketing strategies because of what happened with COVID.
So how does somebody get into being a professor of communication studies, PR, advertising, marketing, all that? Because you've got a PhD, you've studied this, you've been an academic, a researcher, a real scholar of this, but you haven't necessarily been in the workforce doing all those things. So how do you connect from here's what industry is doing, but here's my work as an academic, as a scholar, where I've really gone in depth, probably in more depth than anyone who is just a typical employee. I'm an employee in the industry, but you're probably thinking about it a lot more than maybe I'm thinking about it on a bigger scale.
Yeah, so I think at least for me, so my undergrad degree, one of my concentrations was PR. And so how I approach PR is through this lens of activism and community organizing. And so even though I don't necessarily have industry experience, how I approach PR and strategic communication is really through this lens of PR activism and how various PR strategies and tactics were utilized in various social change movements. And so in terms of connecting that to industry, one of the things that I think as at least is unique with me in the sense of how it's more relevant is the focus on DEIB, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so that is one of the things with the pandemic and with the Black Lives Matter protest and other various social justice movements. This idea of really thinking about your communications and your PR strategies and understanding the importance of making sure the content and messaging you're creating is diverse, is equitable, is accessible, right? And is really representative of what you're trying to do. And so I think in terms of with my background, that is something that I'm finally glad to see that the industry is starting to try to at least catch up with that in ways that they necessarily haven't acknowledged before, or as haven't acknowledged to trying to make real change instead of just performative, I would say.
The last couple of years, it feels like it's really accelerated. It feels like
Yes.
there's certainly a lot more attention companies are giving to that. So what do you see as the disconnect still between companies and the new hires coming in, right? Like your students, they're going through your program, you're getting them up to speed. And mostly, I imagine they're mostly going into the workforce rather than, becoming a scholar or professor like yourself. You're getting them ready for the industry. Where's the disconnect? Either that your students, future employees are not expecting from the workplace, and vice versa. Companies are expecting something different from their new hires.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I at least try to do with how I teach PR and advertising, so I teach from what is known as a service learning lens, where students work with various on-campus and off-campus community organizations and businesses. So that way they get that hands-on learning. And so through that, one of the things that I've noticed, especially more so within the last few years, is that students, I think, and Gen Zers in general, and this has been discussed about through some very scholars who study different generations, is that this idea of emotional development and maturity, and how Gen Zers are, they're a little bit more behind than previous generations. And that's something that I would say that I've found. And so really thinking through then in terms of the workforce, I'm finding some of my students might need a little bit more hand holding or scaffolding in terms of certain things that they need help with in terms of like creating various materials and things like that. And so I think when you get into the workforce, one of the things that I think employers may be struggling with or is like that level of hand holding, and how if you need to write a press release, you're not going to have 2 or 3 weeks to revise it, or you're not going to have, you need to do like, you need to create a press release, a fact sheet, a background, or all of that within like, 2 hours or so. Right. And so again, like, I think that is something that there's a mismatch in terms of the expectations that students are going to have, and then the expectation of the employer in terms of what that working dynamic is going to be.
It's a good reminder. Someone who is going into the workforce, let's say right now, summer 22, they were in high school, right? Spring of 18, right? Like it pretty quickly go from high school to the workforce, passing through college, right? So you say a couple of years ago, I was in high school. A couple of years from now, I'll be in college. So you're talking to people, obviously, who were in high school not that long ago. That K through 12 world, that K through 12 market, we're seeing more digital tools. We saw the COVID learning disruptions or adaptations, you may call it. How much of this new generation are you seeing, like, they're just coming in already? By the time they've graduated high school, they're freshmen in college. And a lot of what you just talked about, their expectations, their skills, their abilities, their habits, it's already just baked in. And it's almost too late for you to maybe get them up to speed to what's going to be expected of them in the workforce. So maybe my question is, how much of the importance is in that kind of K through 12 environment versus the, 4 college years?
Yeah, so I think because I've taught at various institutions, and the various institutions I've taught at, there's different student demographics. So I think it really gets at in terms of the demographic of students that you might be teaching. So for instance, at my previous institution, it was a predominantly a first gen institution, as well as it was much more diverse than my current institution. And so there required different levels of like strategies and things in the classroom. And their K-12 educational experience was very different from someone where I teach now that might be from a more affluent background and affluent public school. But I think that the big disconnect that I'm seeing is the writing. And so that's something that I know that when I was in college, my undergrad, my professors always said our writing stunk. And so that's something that I'm
I feel like
noticing.
every teacher says that to their students,
Yeah.
right? Like every decade, every generation, the writing's not good enough.
Yeah. And so what I'm finding that's different. So I also used to be a special education teacher as well. And so I worked in middle school and in high school after undergrad. And so I graduated during the Great Recession, and it was hard to get a job. And I did Teach for America. And so I have experience in the K-12 setting, and that really influences how I teach my students now, because I'm able to understand like what's good pedagogy, how do I engage different types of learners. And one of the things that I'm finding that I have to do now more than ever before is incorporate various wellness exercises and activities into my classes, as well as like helping students in terms of developing like interpersonal communication skills or small group communication and teamwork communication skills. So even if it's not necessarily a small group communication or interpersonal communication course, I still am finding I need to specifically include certain concepts in some of those the things that in terms of team dynamics and stuff into my classroom, because when you're in PR, students are going to be working with in teams in the industry and as well as in our classes. And so I'm finding that I have to think more strategically in terms of not just presenting content and giving students hands-on opportunities, but I need to do a little bit more than that. I need to make sure that when I am setting up students in teamwork, what are things that I can do to ensure that students are working more collaboratively and effectively. And so I have to think through that in ways, and I'll give that a little bit more thought than I've had to do previously. And I think with the pandemic, it just exacerbated that. And especially when you were doing it virtual, team dynamic is very, very different virtually. And so then that right there, I had to even think through some of the stuff that I was doing. It. The good thing about the pandemic, at least for me, is it made me reevaluate a lot of how I'm teaching and why I'm teaching. And also like how sometimes more is not necessarily best, right? So really cutting back on certain things to make sure students are really getting what they truly need and not just trying to overload students with all this content information.
As you just mentioned, you've taught
a lot.
No, it's good. I guess it leads me to my next question. You've taught at different places. You've taught different demographics, different cohorts of students as to the different places you've been. Do you see something that is similar across all of that based on the generation? When you think about Gen Z and like here's what they are as a monolithic group, or is it actually very dependent on socioeconomic factors, right? Other factors that are beyond just a generation. Because there's so many stories where like, well, this generation does, XYZ, and it's very different than the previous generations, and these are what they are. Is that true? Because you've seen them across different locations. Is that really true? Or is it, no, I'm seeing all kinds of different things out there. It's not so much that their age is defining themselves uniquely.
Well, I think that, at least from my experience, there are certain experiences or cultural phenomenon and things that I think can connect certain generations together. So if we think back to like the boomers, that was like in response to like World War II, right? And so there's a collective sense in terms of certain moments that generation experienced. In terms of millennials, we had the Great Recession and 9/11, as well as the transition from no internet to dial-up to what we have now. And so I think with Gen Zers, a common theme that I'm at least noticing among K-12 as well as college is this idea and this desire of loving technology, and in terms of everything's digital. And so even if they're not necessarily they don't necessarily have the media literacy or the digital media literacy that one might need in terms of what you might post on TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram, and the ethics behind all of that and privacy concerns. They might not necessarily have that knowledge, but there's this desire I'm noticing in terms of embracing technology. And then there's another thing that I'm, in terms of certain values that I'm seeing, is a lot of Gen Zers are more understanding I'm finding in terms of understanding of difference in experiences. And so, and I think that gets at to the importance of DEIB. And so I think that's also part of the reason why a lot of corporations and even nonprofits and things need to recognize they need to not just be performative in their work, because Gen Zers are really care about these various types of issues. And also Gen Zers are just much more diverse in general. So they're the most diverse group of generation that we have. And so I think those are similarities that I think that can connect them. But then in terms of like certain differences in terms of socioeconomics, race, and gender, I do think there are differences, because that then does shape your lived in experience and then what you might experience in terms of your education in K to 12, as well as what you might experience in terms of college and what resources and things you have access to.
Talk about your current research. Like, what are you working on right now? In the summer, you don't have as much teaching, if any. Is it a book coming out? Like, what are you focused on right now? What's on top of your mind?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different projects that I'm working on. So the one project that I'm really excited that I'm working on is on financial literacy. And so this past year, I partnered with a business professor at Westfield State University in Massachusetts, and we've done service learning courses together, where it was a multi-institutional service learning project on financial literacy. He's a finance professor, my students were PR, and we collaborated with TRIO, which is the Upward Bound TRIO program at Westfield, as well as with the Multicultural Center on my university's campus. And so the research I'm doing now, and we're analyzing the survey results, is seeing if students increase their knowledge and if their behaviors changed based on this service learning, this project. And so what that might mean then in terms of how strategic communication can be taught, connecting to various different fields, whether it's financial literacy, or another project I'm working on is dealing with community activism. And so another research project I'm looking at and working on with some of my undergrad students is looking at how strategic communication can be used for community activism on campuses and in the local community, and the impact that might have. And that's more qualitative versus the financial literacy is more quantitative.
When students are asking you for job advice about, hey, I'm thinking about doing PR, right? Or advertising or something related to communications, but should I go in-house? Should I do an agency? Should I, go get a master's? What is your typical advice? It's sort of the standard textbook advice you give based on how you're seeing industry and employee relations.
Yeah, so I always tell students to don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? And so a lot of times what I always try to do with my students first is figure out, like, what is your passion? What is your interest? What are things that you like? What are things that you don't like? And a lot of times actually students don't know that. And so a lot of times what I end up doing is doing a career inventory with them. And in terms of what are some of their values and things, and what type of businesses do they want to work with? So I would say the first advice that I give is what are some of your values or beliefs or passions that how you want to apply your skills, because strategic communication and PR can be applied in any industry, any sector. And so it's really about figuring out what you really like to do. And then once that happens, I then always say, you have to be able to translate what you're doing in the classroom and your internships to the job market. And so then helping them develop that language in terms of something that I'm finding that I always help them with. And so the other big thing I always tell students is that if you're going to grad school, never pay for it. And so always look for a program that might offer a grad assistantship, a teaching assistantship, or a research assistantship, or see if a job that you can get, if they will pay for you to go back to your master's. And so that's something that, especially with PR, a lot of times they care more about experience than necessarily a master's. And so I usually try to give that advice instead of going right to grad school.
That. I like that. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off though. I was going to say, I like that. Don't pay for it. Get someone else to pay for it. It's not worth it if you have to pay for it. Yeah,
exactly. And I have a lot of student loan debt. And so I always don't make the mistakes I did. So, yeah.
And then lastly, what are you excited about for the fall? Is there a new class you're teaching? What are you excited about that you'll be rolling out this fall?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is I'm in the process of developing a service learning partnership with various on-campus and off-campus organizations around democracy and civic engagement in terms of how do we get students involved in the political process with the midterm elections coming up. And so having various voter registration drives. So I'm in the process now of reaching out to our universities, college Republicans and college Democrats, as well as various other on-campus and off-campus organizations, and connect that to my campaigns class as well as my PR and advertising writing class. And so I'm excited in terms of see what will come with that.
I think that's a good place to leave, because if I start getting into the election and Democrats and Republicans and college campuses, we might be here for a long time, right? So I think this has been good, right? This is really interesting to get that perspective, right? What you're teaching, what the students are learning, how they're getting ready for the the workforce, the workplace, and kind of where some of those gaps still are. So Professor Mark, I appreciate the time. This has been really good. So thank you for joining with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.